Sounds impressive, doesn't it? I'm just a workaholic. It really comes down to that. I'm a bit of a ring-in, although I have done some kind of distant work with Western Australia. And I guess some of the most beautiful plants with fantastic flowers, Phyllanthus and Seropus. I did the revision for those species. I'm not quite sure why I'm here today, but basically I was given a little bit of an open slather, which is really terrible. So I had to try and make up what I think you might be interested in. And these photos are just to show that, yes, I do get out in the field quite a bit. I guess I wanted to give some personal experiences over in the East, and just to show you that nothing changes anywhere in the world. No matter where you are, it's always the same problems, the same issues. You still have government and you still have fighting for the right price to do the work that you do. Most of what I'm going to talk about is kind of negative stuff, but let's be honest, there's some really good people out there, there's some really good companies out there, mining, government, great people in them, trying to do the best work. But today I'm just going to concentrate on some of the experiences I've had doing subcontracting for environmental impact statements. And there's a number of things that I'll just go through, just classic examples, I guess. And these are some of the examples I'm going to try and have some personal experience with, I guess. First one I'm going to talk about is an interesting one. It's one about independent pressure on consultants. I don't know, I'm sure it's pretty much the same over here, but for some of the companies, they hire a mid-level kind of auditing kind of company. They're an independent company and they'll work with the subcontracting botanists or ecologists, fauna people. And what they do is they try and dot the I's and cross the T's. And that sounds a really good process, because then the client gets a product that's really got everything how it should be. But what I tended to find in this process, these independent kind of people who cross the I's, dot the T's, or whatever you do, actually put an awful lot of pressure on the contracting botanist or fauna person. And the pressure isn't about really, I guess it's a difficult thing to explain, but it's very much pushing the line of the development to a point where you have to be really sure of your work, and you have to be really sure of, how much you know about your system. Otherwise, you can be very easily guided to a particular answer. And for me, I found this quite struggling sometimes, because I did know my work, and I worked very hard to get the answer as it should be. But it often made me wonder about most of the people who often work in this industry don't have that kind of feeling that they really know their work as well as they should, or they're quite inexperienced and could be very easily guided. So it's a kind of I think a difficult one to talk about, because it's not actually a concerted effort to change results, it's just a gentle, consistent pressure. And if you don't know what you're doing, it's very easy to fall to it. This is a particular area which all the coloured areas are actually endangered communities. This particular company had a bit of a strife, but this was one example where that pressure was quite strong. This is another example of a mining company needing offsets in Eastern Australia, and it was a really interesting process where both the consulting companies that were hired and the government all had a role to play. In this particular one, basically large areas were considered to be grassy box woodland, which is a federally listed community and also listed state-wise as a critically endangered community. It's down to 0.1% of its original cover. A lot of the areas, all this kind of hatched area in here and all the green area and some of this yellow area are all considered parts of that community. This particular mapping is for an offset, so the more of that community you show, the better. What we found when we tried to work through this, we had a whole lot of people independently look at it, and we all said, well, these particular things are very shrubby, and we don't really see any box or gum in there. So we thought maybe they had it a bit wrong. When we went back and checked on how the work was done, they actually used some original mapping. None of this mapping was new by the company. And what they did was they actually just changed the titles. So for example, one of these systems was called Shrubby Gum Woodland, and they just removed the shrubby. Another thing they did was where they placed their sites. So they had a number of sites placed in here, but when you actually looked at how the sites were placed, well, from a map, they looked like they were random. But once you actually walked over the country, you actually found that all the sites were actually put in tiny little patches that you possibly could call box gum. So although there are about a dozen kind of sites through there that actually recorded box gum, none of the other sites had them. So it actually looked like there was a lot in there. So we went in, we put in, I think, over 200 sites, and we found that 4 of them were probably correct. All the others, every single one of those crosses that I've got in there, were an incorrect match to the vegetation type. So the company hired an independent expert to verify whether we were right, half a dozen of us, or the original company was right. And of course, the person they employed as an independent actually worked for the original company. In the past, but still. What we found later was that the state government actually had their own mapping of this area, and their mapping didn't agree with this, but they withheld the mapping. So when all else fails, what can you do? You can move the goalposts. So in this instance, we finally had enough evidence to show that this was really not the case. And so the original environmental impact agreement said that the company had to have their offsets done before they actually started the next lot of mining. Otherwise, they couldn't proceed. So what happened next was the rules were changed, and they said, you can have the offsets 20 years from now. And by that time, all of us won't be looking at the sites again. So another way around things, this was a particular job I was involved with in southeast Queensland. These little dots in here were circles. There are federally threatened plant species, a melaleuca, and under the guidelines you had to have an area around the species to protect it. This was a housing development. And so as you can see, all these circles start to impinge once they coalesce together on a lot of housing. Over here is also a listed endangered community, and the darker green is where it's absolutely definitely it. This in-between colour is where it probably is it, and the other one it probably isn't, but shares some of the characteristics. We're also told by the proponent when we went on that, you know, they've lived there for 100 years, there's no koala. We saw koalas in every tree. So basically, we did the report, and unfortunately, there's a system of confidentiality agreements when you do some of these reports. So if you don't like the report, let's just put it on the shelf, hire another consultant, and that's exactly what happened. So I think I've seen some of these systems where 2 or 3 reports get shelved before they actually get the right result. The right result, of course. This is another one where I heard somebody talk about, let's get the job of a flora and fauna survey done at the beginning, or at least at some appropriate stage. This was a road development. So with the state government, we're going to put a road through, and they actually had, this isn't actually the road, but I had a picture of a road, so I put this in. Let's just say you have all the vehicles right here, and they're waiting. And it's at that point they decide to do a flora survey. They've got the engines running. Can you do this today? So, okay, we went out and had a look. So the first thing we found was threatened grass species. And we found a fair bit of it, but, you know, we said, okay, we need a few more days now. We found this species. What we really want to do is put it into context. Is there a lot of this grass around? If there's heaps of it around, then maybe we can say it's not such a bad thing for you to run through. If there's only a few of them, then we've got to go to the next level. They didn't like that answer. So they flew somebody in from Sydney to have a look, who actually wasn't a grass expert, and they said, it's not here. The first person was wrong. And so they thought, great, let's get going. So they revved up the engines again and said, we're going to bring in, but of course that person that they brought in was from the government, so they still needed an independent consultant to confirm. So they eventually brought in a grassland expert. Yes, there's heaps of it. Have to go back to the drawing board, turn your engines off. Another way around these things is to build your own case. This was a particular one about cypress pine thinning. So there was an idea, we want to open up some of our conservation areas for biodiversity thinning. The idea behind this one was that there's this big area called the Pilliga, which is a fantastic big, one of the largest remnants in New South Wales. But it's dominated a lot by cypress pine. In order to put a lot of these areas into reserve, they had to pay off some of the companies to say, okay, well, here's compensation for you not being able to get in there anymore. A couple of years later, some of these people wanted to actually get back in there, even though they had money from the government. And so the government decided, well, maybe we can log it for biodiversity. If we send people in there and we start thinning out the pine, we can have a biodiversity outcome. And so we had a whole lot of experts on this panel, social experts, economists, and all sorts of things, and they all agreed there wasn't any point. This may supply 6 jobs, but they won't last. This town that this company wants to open up for, again, it's only 6 jobs, they're not going to last. There's no point in doing this. And of course, the biodiversity study showed that there was heaps of literature, in fact, at least 5 or 6 journal-published articles showing that there was no reason to thin. Biodiversity was great under these unthinned stands, and that no way by thinning them you would actually increase the situation. So the way around to that is to muddy the waters, a bit like fake news. So to combat these 5 or so journal articles and various experts at universities, how they combated that was they had some vague study done at Western Plains Zoo, which was not replicated, but somebody said, we think we had more species if we thinned it. And that was enough to muddy the waters to give a potential go-ahead for opening all this area up. We do, well, myself and a colleague of mine, we do a lot of auditing for the federal government when they get particular reports in from consultants, and we have a look at them and see if they're okay or what they've missed. And of course, I've worked with a lot of companies, subcontracted myself. And one of the things that's really comes across all the time is, where are these people coming from? I remember working in a great big coal seam gas project in central Queensland, and just about everybody who came in were from all over the place. They were junior staff, people who had only been out of university 1 or 2 years. All their experience was either over here in Western Australia, from Tasmania, Victoria, and they were flown and dumped into the middle of central Queensland and expected that they would get on top of this straight away. And this is really, really common. I'm sure it's the same over here, is that you get all these people who have no idea what you talk to a lawyer and you say, you study criminal law, how about you come over and help us get our house through or something like that. They'll say, no, it's a completely different type of law. So why people expect that just because you've got a botany degree, you can be dumped in Southeast Asia or Tasmania and really get to speed straight away? I don't know. The common things that we come up with when we look at reviewing some of these is there's just no way you found that species. It doesn't occur in this part of the world. Is one day really enough to survey 100,000 hectares? I don't think so, but we have found some of these. Cut and paste, we actually had this one particular job where we took the person to the site and said, well, did you actually come here? No. This was a company that actually lived down the corner from where this site was, a few blocks away. They said, no, we didn't come on site, we just cut and paste from one of our other reports, the whole flora survey, and put it into the report. Of course, we've talked about surveying at the wrong part of time, so I won't go into that. And did you actually read the determination? Box gum is a great one. And one of the reasons why I like to bring this one up is that the federal determination says you must survey with a 20 by 50 metre site to look at how many species are in that site. I can say that looking at hundreds and hundreds of documents, I have never found anyone who's done that. Yet it's a basic tenet into how to survey this community. And I'm sure that's the same for many others. I'm probably going to run out of time to talk about the statewide mapping. But this is the state government. They were trying to put up a mapping for the state. And basically, it's to underpin everything. I'll just quickly go through some of it. And one of the things they did was they never really audited it themselves very well. So we went in and had a quick look at one of the areas here, Namoy, and we found basically, I'll just rush through this, after looking at 2,000 sites, they claimed 71% accuracy. We got down to, at best, 30, if you were really stretching it. So there we go, some of our results. It's just, for various reasons, the way they chose their sites to prove their accuracy was very, very dodgy. So I'll just rush through this. So, Upper Hunt is an interesting one. They tried to use the same strategy in Upper Hunter. Now, the reason why this one is interesting is that they were trying to use a strategy whereby they would give approval for an entire region. For every mining development in that region would only have to be processed once in a 30-year period. And if this worked, they were going to roll that out across the state in other mining areas. And because it was a kind of an agreement between the federal government, the state government and mining companies, it could have been rolled out across the country. But again, what we found was that the data underlying it was incredibly poor, and that you couldn't use it really to have a look at where the impacts were, especially to work out cumulative impacts and also to work out where we could offset. And basically, most of the systems were so poorly mapped, you would be better off just putting a blindfold on and drawing lines yourself. So basically, yeah, I'll just skip this one because I just went through some of the errors and where we found them. We did another assessment in the Upper Hunter and had a look at, over 2,000 sites to check on the mapping in there. Again, this process is to underpin all the EIAs. And what we found was that we had a greater coverage of our data. We also had less bias in our data. And while they were claiming 65.3% accuracy, at best we could only find 30%. And one of the things that we did here was if they had a polygon next door to a wrong polygon, but the one next door was right, we said, well, okay, let's say they're right for the one that they're wrong. And also we had a look at up to 10 plant community types that we said could be incorrect but possibly correct. And even by giving them all this leeway, we only came up with about 30% accuracy. Now, why some of the difference in this accuracy is that basically they chose which sites to look at for accuracy. They only chose the best modelled systems to look at the accuracy. They didn't look at the accuracy of poorly modelled communities. they didn't tell you which kind of, which data they used to test either. And so basically it was all a bit of a cloak and daggers and mirrors situation. I wish I could have a bit more time to work through this, but basically it's just giving you an overview. And that's some of the issues we had with it. I'll just leave it at that because I'm running out of time.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Thanks, John. Do you have any questions?
John, I know that this modelling thing was one of the ones that